Close your eyes. Picture a pot of water on a stove. Nothing is happening yet. The surface is flat, glassy, almost arrogant in its stillness. You have seen this 1,000 times. You have waited for this 1,000 times. And in that waiting, in that silence before the first bubble, there is a story older than language itself. This is a documentary about boiling water. Yes, you read that correctly. 5 hours about heating a liquid until it becomes a gas. If that sounds absurd to you, good. Hold on to that feeling. Because the real absurdity is that you have spent your entire life performing one of the most revolutionary acts in human history and never once stopped to ask why. Water covers 71% of the Earth's surface. It composes roughly 60% of your body. It falls from clouds, carves canyons, drowns cities, and sustains every living organism we have ever cataloged. And yet, for most of human existence, it was also one of the most reliable ways to die. Untreated water is a carnival of microscopic horror. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, hepatitis, parasitic worms with names that sound like forgotten Latin curses. For millennia, the very substance that kept us alive was simultaneously and quite enthusiastically killing us. The irony is almost poetic if you enjoy poetry written by pathogens. But somewhere in the deep past, a human being held fire beneath water and changed everything. Not with a speech, not with a manifesto, with patience, curiosity, and probably a burnt hand. That anonymous act, repeated across continents and centuries, would become the invisible foundation upon which civilization was built. Consider what boiling water made possible. There, coffee, sterilized surgical instruments, steam engines, power plants, pasta. The entire nation of Britain, arguably, runs on the principle that water should be heated and then poured over dried leaves. Remove boiling from history, and you do not merely lose a cooking technique. You lose modernity. This film is not a tutorial. You will not learn the optimal time to add salt, though we will have opinions. This is an excavation, a 5-hour dig into the sediment layers of something so fundamental that it became invisible. We're going to make it visible again, and the view, I promise you, is unsettling. We will begin where all human stories begin, with fire. Then we will move through ancient civilizations that worshipped water and the empires that weaponized it. We will meet scientists who unlocked its secrets and epidemiologists who traced its invisible murders. We will visit altitudes where water refuses to cooperate and kitchens where it is taken grotesquely for granted. Along the way, we will encounter a surprising number of dead people. Not because this is a morbid exercise, though it occasionally will be, but because the history of boiling water is inseparable from the history of human mortality. Every bubble that rises to the surface of your evening tea carries with it the ghost of someone who drank their water cold and paid for it. The physicists will tell you that boiling is a phase transition, a change of state from liquid to gas occurring at a temperature determined by atmospheric pressure. That is accurate. It is also, and I say this with respect, spectacularly boring. The truth is far stranger. Boiling is an act of violence performed at the molecular level, and we do it every morning before breakfast. At precisely 100 degrees Celsius, at sea level, water molecules gain enough kinetic energy to overcome their intermolecular hydrogen bonds. They break free from the liquid surface and escape into the atmosphere as vapor. What looks peaceful from the outside is, at the atomic scale, a prison break. Billions of molecules shattering their chains simultaneously. Every culture on Earth has a relationship with this transformation. The Japanese have a word, yuzumashi, for water that has been boiled and then cooled. The Chinese philosophical tradition considers boiled water, or kai shui, a cornerstone of health. The British, as mentioned, have constructed an entire national identity around it. No one is neutral about hot water. No one. And yet, despite its universality, despite its role in medicine, industry, agriculture, and warfare, The act of boiling water has never received the historical treatment it deserves. There are no monuments to the first boil, no holidais, no statues of the anonymous genius who thought, perhaps I should heat this before drinking it. This documentary intends to correct that omission, not with reverence, though some is warranted, but with the kind of obsessive, slightly unhinged curiosity that the subject demands. If you're the type of person who has ever stared at a boiling pot and thought, what exactly is happening in there? Then welcome. You are among friends. Strange friends, but friends nonetheless. Before we begin our journey backward through time, let us establish one crucial fact. Boiling water is not simple. It appears simple, the way a swan appears to glide effortlessly across a lake while its legs churn frantically beneath the surface. The simplicity is a performance. Beneath it lies thermodynamics, chemistry, biology, and an uncomfortably large body count. The World Health Organization estimates that contaminated water kills over 500,000 people every single year. 500,000. That is roughly the population of Lisbon or Luxembourg, vanishing annually because their water was not boiled. In the 21st century, with all our technology, all our knowledge, all our supposed progress, the pot remains unheated. The lesson remains unlearned. This is why 5 hours is not excessive. This is why treating boiling water as a trivial subject would be, in a very real sense, an act of historical negligence. The story of how humans learned to boil water is the story of how humans learned to survive. And survival, as we will discover, has never been simple or clean or polite. So, let's begin at the beginning. Not with water, which has been here for roughly 4 billion years and does not need an introduction, but with fire, because water, left to its own devices, is perfectly content to remain a liquid. It takes something violent, something hungry, something fundamentally destructive to convince it otherwise. Fire was humanity's first technology, not a tool held in the hand, but a force captured and contained. And the moment that force was directed at water, a new chapter in the human story opened. A chapter written in steam and survival, in scalded fingers and saved lives, in the quiet heroism of doing something so ordinary that no one remembers to call it extraordinary. The pot is on the stove. The burner is lit. The water is still, but not for long. Nothing in this story stays still for long. 2 million years ago, give or take a few 100,000, a creature that was not quite human and not quite ape stood upright on the African savanna and looked at fire. Not the way an animal looks at fire, which is to say with terror and the urgent desire to be elsewhere. This creature looked at it with something new, something dangerous, curiosity. We call this creature Homo erectus, the upright human, and it is to this long extinct relative that we owe the most consequential relationship in our species' history. Not the relationship between humans and other humans, which came later and remains, frankly, a work in progress. The relationship between humans and fire. The earliest credible evidence for controlled fire use comes from the Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa's Northern Cape Province. There, in a layer of sediment dated to approximately 1 million years ago, archaeologists found ash deposits, burned bone fragments, and charred plant remains. Not a wildfire's aftermath. Something more deliberate. Something tended. The Wonderwerk findings, published by a team led by Francesco Berna of Boston University in 2012, sent tremors through the archaeological community. If fire was being controlled 1 million years ago, then the timeline for every subsequent human innovation had to be reconsidered. Cooking, tool-making, social gathering, warmth management, and eventually the heating of water. But let us be clear about what controlled fire means in this context. It does not mean a neatly constructed hearth with a chimney and a mantelpiece. It means a creature intelligent enough to carry a smoldering branch from a lightning-struck tree back to a sheltered location, feed it with dry grass, and keep it alive. That alone required a cognitive leap that no other species has ever replicated. Further north, at the Gesher Banat Yaakov site along the Jordan River in modern Israel, archaeologist Naama Goren Inbar and her team uncovered evidence of fire use dating to approximately 790,000 years ago. Burned flint, clustered in specific areas of the excavation, suggested not just fire use but spatial organization. Designated fire zones, the earliest kitchens, if you will. Harvard primatologist Richard Wrangham proposed a theory in his 2009 book, Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human. That changed the conversation entirely. Wrangham argued that the control of fire and the subsequent invention of cooking was not a minor upgrade in early human life. It was the upgrade, the single innovation that separated us from every other primate on the evolutionary tree. Wrangham's argument was elegant and disturbing. Cooking breaks down the cellular structure of food, making nutrients more bioavailable and easier to digest. This meant early humans who cooked could extract more calories from the same amount of food while spending less energy digesting it. The surplus energy went somewhere remarkable: the brain. Cooking, Wrangham suggested, literally made us smarter. If Wrangham is right, and the evidence increasingly suggests he is, then fire did not merely warm our ancestors. It rewired them. It expanded their cranial capacity, extended their lifespans, enabled social structures built around shared meals, and set the stage for language, art, and eventually, mercifully, plumbing. But here is the question that haunts this chapter like smoke lingering in a cave. When did fire meet water? When did some curious, hungry, possibly desperate hominid take the revolutionary step of applying heat not to meat, not to roots, not to seeds, but to the liquid itself? The honest answer is, we do not know, and that ignorance is maddening. The problem is archaeological visibility. Fire leaves traces: charcoal, ash, burned bone, heat-altered stone. Water, by its very nature, leaves almost nothing. It evaporates. It seeps. It disappears. Trying to find evidence of the first boiled water is like trying to find evidence of the first whispered conversation. The medium itself conspires against the record. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that early humans almost certainly heated water long before they had vessels to contain it. The technique is called stone boiling, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You heat rocks in a fire until they are scorching, then transfer them into a natural depression, a hollow log, an animal stomach, or a bark container filled with water. The water heats. Eventually it boils. Stone boiling is not theoretical. It was observed and documented among indigenous peoples across North America, Australia, and Siberia well into the modern era. The Blackfoot people of the Great Plains used buffalo stomach pouches as cooking vessels, dropping fire-heated stones into the liquid to bring it to temperature. Functional, efficient, and deeply ingenious. Experimental archaeologists have replicated stone boiling with impressive results. Using river cobbles heated to roughly 500 degrees Celsius and transferred into water-filled high containers, researchers have brought several liters of water to a rolling boil in under 15 minutes. No kla, no metal, no engineering degree, just fire, stone, and the refusal to drink cold, potentially lethal water. But stone boiling has limitations. It is labor-intensive, requiring constant attention to heating, transferring, and replacing stones. The containers are fragile and temporary, and the water, inevitably, carries a faint mineral taste from the rocks, a seasoning that no one asked for. For boiling to become a daily habit rather than an occasional technique, humanity needed something more durable. It needed pottery. The oldest known pottery in the world was found in the Xianrending Cave in Jiangxi Province, China. Radiocarbon dating placed these crude, thick-walled ceramic fragments at approximately 20,000 years old. 20,000 years. While much of Europe was still buried under glacial ice, someone in southern China was shaping wet clay into a vessel and firing it hard enough to hold liquid over flame. These early pots were not beautiful. They were lumpy, uneven, and prone to cracking. But they were revolutionary. For the first time in human history, water could be placed directly over fire and heated continuously without the frantic choreography of stone boiling. The pot was not an invention. It was an emancipation. The Jomon people of prehistoric Japan produced some of the earliest and most sophisticated pottery in the world, dating to roughly 16,000 years ago. Their vessels, decorated with distinctive cord markings that gave the culture its name, show clear evidence of being used for cooking and boiling. Chemical residue analysis has identified traces of fish oils and plant starches embedded in the clay walls. Think about what pottery meant for water. Before clay vessels, water was something you went to. A river, a spring, a lake. It existed in the landscape, and you existed in relation to it. After pottery, water was something you carried with you. You contained it. You controlled it. You decided when and where and how it would change. That shift in agency was profound. And with that agency came the ability to transform water at will. Not just to drink it, but to heat it, purify it, infuse it, and eventually to power machines with it. The clay pot sitting on a Neolithic hearth was, in retrospect, the prototype for the steam engine, the autoclave, the nuclear reactor's cooling system. Every technology of heat and water traces its lineage back to that imperfect, lumpy vessel. The journey from open flame to clay pot took roughly 1 million years. 1 million years of stone boiling, bark containers, animal pouches, and inventive desperation. If you ever feel impatient waiting for your kettle to click off, consider that your ancestors spent a geological epoch waiting for the right technology to arrive. Your 3 minutes of waiting are, comparatively, nothing. But the clay pot, transformative as it was, merely opened a door. What walked through that door over the next 20 millennia was a parade of civilizations that would each find their own reasons to boil water, their own rituals, their own meanings. Some would use it to heal, some would use it to conquer, and some, as we shall see, would use it to wage quiet, invisible wars against enemies too small to see with the naked eye. Let us pause the history for a moment and talk about what is actually happening inside that pot. Because if you're going to spend 5 hours learning about boiling water, you deserve to understand it at the molecular level. Fair warning, it is weirder than you think. Much weirder. Water does not behave like other liquids, and that disobedience is precisely what makes it so important. A single water molecule consists of 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to 1 oxygen atom at an angle of approximately 104.5 degrees. This angular shape gives water a permanent dipole moment, meaning one end of the molecule carries a slight positive charge and the other a slight negative charge. Water is, in essence, a tiny magnet, and like all magnets, is attracted to its neighbors. These intermolecular attractions are called hydrogen bonds, and they're the reason water is so peculiar. Hydrogen bonds are relatively weak individually, roughly 1/20th the strength of the covalent bonds holding each molecule together. But water forms them constantly, dynamically, in vast interconnected networks. At any given moment, each water molecule is hydrogen bonded to approximately 3.4 of its neighbors. This network is what gives liquid water its unusually high boiling point. By all rights, based on its molecular weight alone, water should be a gas at room temperature. Hydrogen sulfide, a molecule of similar size, boils at -60 degrees Celsius. If water followed the same rules, there would be no oceans, no rivers, no rain, no life. Hydrogen bonds are, quite literally, the reason you exist. So what happens when you apply heat to this hydrogen-bonded network? You add energy, kinetic energy specifically, which manifests as faster molecular motion. The molecules begin to vibrate more intensely, rotate more freely, and translate more rapidly through the liquid. The hydrogen bonds stretch, break, reform, and break again with increasing frequency. The network begins to destabilize. At first, this added energy simply raises the temperature of the liquid. This is what physicists call sensible heat, energy you can measure with a thermometer. Water's specific heat capacity, the amount of energy required to raise 1 gram by 1 degree Celsius, is 4.186 joules. That number is remarkably high, nearly twice that of most common liquids. Heating water is, thermodynamically speaking, expensive. This is why a watch pot seems to take forever. It is not your imagination. Water genuinely resists heating more stubbornly than almost any other substance you will encounter in a kitchen. It absorbs enormous amounts of energy while barely changing temperature, like a bureaucracy absorbing complaints. The energy goes in, almost nothing visibly comes out, until suddenly, dramatically, it does. The first visible sign of heating is dissolved gas escaping from the water. Those tiny bubbles that appear on the bottom and sides of the pot long before boiling begins are not steam. They are air, nitrogen, and oxygen that were dissolved in the cold water and are now being driven out by the rising temperature. It is the water exhaling, if you want to be poetic about it. As temperature continues to rise, you will notice a phenomenon that many people mistake for boiling: simmering. At roughly 80 to 95 degrees Celsius, small bubbles of actual water vapor begin forming at the bottom of the pot, where the heat source is closest. These bubbles rise a short distance, then collapse as they encounter cooler water above. It is a false start, a rehearsal for the main event. The French have a beautiful term for this stage: frémissement, which translates roughly to a shiver. The water is shivering. It knows what is coming. It is gathering its energy molecule by molecule, bond by bond, preparing for the violent phase transition that will transform it from a liquid into a gas. The shiver is the overture before the symphony. True boiling, what scientists call nucleate boiling, occurs when the temperature at the bottom of the pot reaches 100 degrees Celsius at standard atmospheric pressure. At this point, water vapor bubbles form at specific locations called nucleation sites. Tiny scratches, pits, or imperfections on the pot's surface where dissolved gases have been trapped. These imperfections are not flaws. They're launch pads. The bubbles that form at nucleation sites grow rapidly, fed by the surrounding superheated liquid. When they reach sufficient size, buoyancy overcomes surface tension, and they detach from the surface, rising through the liquid in a turbulent column. At the surface, they burst, releasing their cargo of water vapor into the atmosphere. This is what you see when you look at a rolling boil. Thousands of tiny explosions per second. Here is something that surprises most people. Once water reaches a full boil, adding more heat does not make it hotter. The temperature stays locked at 100 degrees Celsius, no matter how high you turn the burner. All that additional energy goes into converting liquid water into steam, a process that requires an astonishing 2,260 joules per gram. This is called the latent heat of vaporization. The discovery of latent heat belongs to Joseph Black, a Scottish chemist and physician who conducted his groundbreaking experiments in the 1760s at the University of Glasgow. Black noticed that ice at 0 degrees did not immediately become water at 0 degrees when heat was applied. Instead, it absorbed a tremendous amount of energy while remaining at the same temperature, changing state rather than warming up. Black called this phenomenon latent heat, from the Latin latere, meaning to lie hidden. The energy was there, doing real physical work, but it was invisible to the thermometer. It was hidden in the phase change itself, breaking intermolecular bonds rather than increasing molecular speed. Black had discovered that temperature and heat were not the same thing, a distinction that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary in 1761. Black's work directly influenced his friend and colleague James Watt, who was at that very moment trying to improve the Newcomen steam engine in a workshop at the same university. Watt's insight, that the engine wasted enormous energy by repeatedly heating and cooling the same cylinder, was a direct application of Black's latent heat discovery. The science of boiling water would, quite literally, power the Industrial Revolution. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before Black and Watt, before the Industrial Revolution, humanity needed a way to measure this boiling point accurately. That required thermometers, and thermometers required someone to decide what numbers to put on them. Enter two men whose last names you use every day without thinking: Daniel Gabriel Fahrenheit and Anders Celsius. Fahrenheit, a Polish-born Dutch physicist, developed his mercury thermometer in 1714. His temperature scale, still used in the United States and a handful of other countries, placed the boiling point of water at 212 degrees. Why 212? Because Fahrenheit calibrated his scale using 3 reference points: the freezing point of a salt and ice mixture at 0, the freezing point of pure water at 32, and human body temperature at 96. The boiling point was a calculated consequence, not a design choice. Anders Celsius, a Swedish astronomer, proposed his scale in 1742, and his approach was far more elegant, or at least more metric. He originally placed the boiling point of water at 0 and the freezing point at 100, which seems backward until you learn that Celsius was an astronomer accustomed to measuring things from high to low. His colleagues later inverted the scale after his death, giving us the 0 to 100 range we use today. There is something darkly appropriate about the fact that Celsius died of tuberculosis at age 42, just 2 years after proposing his scale. He never saw it inverted. He never saw it adopted worldwide. He gave humanity a way to measure the most important temperature in domestic life and did not live long enough to benefit from it. The history of science is littered with such ironies. Let us address one more scientific curiosity before we leave this chapter: superheating. Under certain conditions, water can be heated above 100 degrees Celsius without boiling. This occurs when the container is extremely smooth, lacking the nucleation sites where bubbles normally form. The water becomes metastable, sitting quietly at 101, 102, even 105 degrees, waiting for a disturbance. When that disturbance arrives, a spoon, a grain of sugar, a slight bump, the superheated water erupts violently, flashing into steam instantaneously. This is called a bumping event, and it can be genuinely dangerous. Microwave ovens, which heat water evenly without creating convection currents, are particularly prone to causing superheating. It is one of the few ways that boiling water can surprise you, and the surprise is never pleasant. The science of boiling, then, is not a simple story of heat goes in and bubbles come out. It is a story of molecular warfare, hidden energy, counterintuitive physics, and the occasional violent surprise. The pot on your stove is a thermodynamic battleground, and the water inside is far more interesting and far more dangerous than it appears. The scientists understood this. Now, so do you. There is a legend, almost certainly apocryphal, but too perfect to ignore, that tea was discovered by accident in 2737 BCE. Emperor Shennong, a figure of Chinese mythology credited with the invention of agriculture and herbal medicine, was sitting beneath a wild tea tree while his servant boiled water nearby. Dried leaves fell from the tree into the pot. The emperor tasted the resulting infusion and declared it magnificent. Whether or not Shennong existed, and most historians suspect he did not, the legend tells us something important about how Chinese culture understood boiling water. It was not accidental. It was not crude. It was an act of refinement, of civilization itself. The servant was already boiling water before the tea leaves fell. Boiling was the default. The tea was a bonus. In fact, the Chinese practice of drinking boiled water, known as Kai Shui or simply Kai Shui, predates tea and persists independently of it to this day. Walk into any restaurant, hospital, or train station in modern China, and you'll find a hot water dispenser. Ask for cold water, and you may receive a look of polite concern, as though you have just requested something mildly self-destructive. This tradition is rooted in traditional Chinese medicine, which classifies foods and drinks as hot, warm, cool, or cold based on their effects on the body's qi or vital energy. Cold water is believed to shock the digestive system, constrict blood vessels, and disrupt the body's internal balance. Hot water, by contrast, aids digestion, promotes circulation, and maintains harmony. The science may be debatable. The cultural commitment is not. The irony, of course, is that the Chinese were accidentally right for the wrong reasons. Boiling water does not balance your qi, whatever qi is, but it does kill cholera, typhoid, and a host of other waterborne pathogens that were, at that very moment in history, devastating populations that drank their water cold. China's cultural preference for boiled water was, inadvertently, one of the greatest public health interventions in ancient history. Tea itself would not become a widespread cultural phenomenon in China until the Tang Dynasty, roughly 618 to 907 CE, when the scholar Lu Yu wrote the Classic of Tea, the world's first comprehensive treatise on tea cultivation, preparation, and consumption. Lu Yu elevated tea from a medicinal drink to an art form, prescribing specific water sources, vessel types, and boiling stages for optimal preparation. Lu Yu identified 3 stages of boiling water, which he described with characteristic poetic precision. The first boil, when small bubbles appear like fish eyes, was too gentle. The second, when bubbles stream upward like strings of pearls, was ideal for tea. The third, when the surface churns violently, was too aggressive and would, he warned, ruin the flavor. 1,000 years before thermometers, Lu Yu is calibrating temperature by observation. The Tang Dynasty's obsession with tea was not merely aesthetic. It was economic. Tea became one of China's most valuable commodities, traded along the Silk Road and taxed heavily by the imperial government. The Tea Horse Road, a network of ancient trade routes stretching from Yunnan province to Tibet, carried compressed tea bricks over some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. All of it began with boiled water. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ancient world, the Romans had their own relationship with heated water, though their version involved considerably less poetry and considerably more nudity. The Roman public bath, or thermae, was one of the most distinctive institutions of Roman civilization, combining hygiene, socializing, exercise, and political intrigue under one elaborately engineered roof. The baths of Caracalla, completed around 216 CE under Emperor Caracalla, could accommodate an estimated 1,600 bathers simultaneously. The complex covered approximately 25 acres and included a frigidarium with cold water, a tepidarium with warm water, a caldarium with hot water, swimming pools, exercise yards, libraries, and gardens. It was less a bathhouse and more a small city dedicated to the principle that water should be heated and shared. The engineering required to heat these vast quantities of water was extraordinary. Roman bath complexes used a system called a hypocaust, essentially an underfloor heating system in which hot air from wood-burning furnaces circulated through channels beneath raised floors and through hollow walls. The water in the caldarium was heated by direct contact with furnace-heated bronze or lead tanks. Slaves, naturally, did most of the actual work. At the peak of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome alone had over 900 public baths. Entrance fees were minimal, sometimes waived entirely by politicians seeking popularity. A Roman citizen of modest means could, on any given afternoon, walk into a marble-clad building, undress, exercise, be oiled and scraped clean by an attendant, and then immerse themselves in water heated to various temperatures. Free healthcare, Roman style. But the baths were more than hygiene. They were politics. Business deals were negotiated in the tepidarium. Senators gathered intelligence in the caldarium. Social hierarchies were performed and reinforced in the carefully segregated changing rooms. The Roman bath was, in modern terms, a networking event with better architecture and fewer business cards. When the Roman Empire fell, its baths fell with it. The elaborate hypocaust systems required constant maintenance, a steady supply of fuel, and a functioning civic administration to operate. By the 6th century, most of the great thermae of Rome lay in ruins, their pipes cracked, their furnaces cold, their pools dry. Europe would not see public bathing on this scale again for over 1,000 years. South of Rome, across the Mediterranean, Ancient Egypt had its own traditions of heated water, though the evidence is more fragmentary. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE and one of the oldest known medical texts, contains references to heated water used in medicinal preparations, poultices, and steam inhalation treatments. The Egyptians may not have bathed as publicly as the Romans, but they understood the therapeutic potential of hot water. Egyptian physicians, or SWNW as they were known, prescribed heated herbal infusions for a remarkable range of ailments: digestive complaints, respiratory infections, skin conditions, and gynecological issues. The base of nearly every prescription was water, heated to varying temperatures and combined with ingredients ranging from honey and garlic to considerably less appetizing substances like crocodile dung. Medical science has, thankfully, evolved. Further east, the ancient Indian tradition of Ayurveda, which dates to at least 1500 BCE and possibly earlier, also placed enormous emphasis on the temperature and preparation of drinking water. The Charaka Samhita, one of Ayurveda's foundational texts, devotes considerable space to the properties of water boiled to various degrees and then cooled, arguing that each stage of cooling confers different medicinal benefits. According to Ayurvedic tradition, water boiled down to 3/4 of its original volume is suitable for people with Vata constitution. Water reduced to half is appropriate for Pitta types, and water boiled down to 1/4 is prescribed for Kapha dominance. The specificity is remarkable, even if the underlying theory bears little resemblance to modern biochemistry. What matters is the universality of the impulse. Heat the water. Always heat the water. Across cultures, across continents, across millennia, the message was consistent. Cold water was suspect. Hot water was safe, sacred, civilized. The ancient world did not have germ theory. It did not have microscopes. It did not know about Vibrio cholerae or Salmonella typhi. But it had something almost as valuable: cultural instinct, codified into tradition and enforced by habit. Boil your water. The ancestors insisted, and the ancestors were right. The great irony of this chapter is that the civilizations which most enthusiastically embraced hot water were often the ones that survived longest. China's continuous cultural tradition stretching over 4,000 years, India's enduring Ayurvedic practices, the longevity of the Roman social fabric while its baths still functioned. Correlation is not causation, as any statistician will remind you, but the pattern is difficult to ignore entirely. What the ancients built with hot water was not merely hygiene or medicine. It was social infrastructure. The Chinese tea house, the Roman bath, the Indian Ayurvedic clinic. These were institutions where people gathered, bonded, debated, and formed the social contracts that held communities together. Boiling water was the pretext. Civilization was the product. But civilizations rise and civilizations fall, and when they fall, their knowledge often falls with them. The Roman hypocaust was forgotten. The subtleties of Lu Yu's tea preparation were lost for centuries. And in Europe, as we are about to discover, the hard-won wisdom of heating water was abandoned in favor of something that seemed simpler, tasted better, and was considerably more dangerous: drinking it raw. In the summer of 1854, the Soho district of London was a crowded, pungent, lively neighborhood of roughly 30,000 souls packed into narrow streets and aging buildings. It was home to butchers, tailors, seamstresses, and their families. It had pubs, churches, and a workhouse. And on August 31st of that year, it became a killing ground. In the space of 3 days, 127 people living within a few hundred yards of the intersection of Broad Street and Cambridge Street fell ill with cholera and died. Within 10 days, the death toll had passed 500. Within 3 weeks, over 3/4 of the residents had fled the neighborhood entirely. Those who remained were either too sick, too poor, or too stubborn to leave. Cholera is not a gentle disease. Its symptoms begin with sudden, profuse, watery diarrhea, sometimes producing up to 20 liters of fluid loss per day. The skin becomes cold and clammy. The eyes sink into their sockets. The blood thickens as dehydration progresses. Muscle cramps contort the body. Death, when it comes, arrives through circulatory collapse, and it can arrive within hours of the first symptom. Hours. The bacterium responsible, Vibrio cholerae, is a comma-shaped, flagellated organism that thrives in warm, brackish water. It produces a toxin called cholera toxin, or CT, which binds to the epithelial cells lining the small intestine and triggers a massive outpouring of chloride ions and water into the intestinal lumen. The body is essentially flushed from the inside. It is, from the bacterium's perspective, an efficient dispersal strategy. From the host perspective, it is a nightmare. Cholera's ancestral home is the Ganges Delta region of the Indian subcontinent, where it has existed in endemic form for centuries, possibly millennia. Hindu texts from as early as 400 BCE describe a disease with symptoms unmistakably consistent with cholera. But for most of its history, cholera stayed close to home, limited by the speed of human travel and the boundaries of trade routes. That changed in 1817, when the first cholera pandemic erupted from the Bengal region and swept across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Africa. The catalyst was likely a combination of climatic conditions, troop movements during the Anglo-Maratha Wars, and the increasingly connected networks of colonial trade. Cholera, previously a regional affliction, had gone global, and it would not stop. Between 1817 and 1923, the world endured 6 major cholera pandemics. Each one was worse than the last, reaching further, killing more, and exposing the abysmal state of public sanitation in the rapidly industrializing cities of Europe and North America. The second pandemic, from 1829 to 1851, reached London, Paris, New York, and Moscow. The third, from 1852 to 1860, killed over 1 million people in Russia alone. The medical establishment's response to cholera was, by modern standards, spectacularly wrong. The prevailing theory of disease in the mid-19th century was miasma theory, which held that illness was caused by bad air, noxious vapors rising from decaying organic matter. Cholera, according to the miasmatists, was spread by the foul smells emanating from the open sewers and cesspools of London's poorer districts. The miasma theory was not stupid. It was a reasonable inference from observable evidence. Disease did seem to cluster in areas that smelled terrible. It was simply wrong in its mechanism. The smell and the disease had the same cause, contaminated water and sewage, but the smell was not doing the killing. The water was. This distinction would take decades to establish, and thousands of people died in the interval. Enter Jon Snow, not the fictional character from a fantasy series, though the real Jon Snow had arguably a more interesting story. Born in 1813 in York, the eldest son of a coal laborer, Snow became one of the most skilled physicians in London. He was a pioneer of anesthesia, personally administering chloroform to Queen Victoria during the births of 2 of her children. He was meticulous, brilliant, and stubborn. Snow had been skeptical of miasma theory since the 1849 cholera outbreak, during which he published a pamphlet titled On the Mode of Communication of Cholera. In it, he proposed that cholera was transmitted not through air, but through water contaminated with the excretions of infected individuals. The medical establishment was unimpressed. Snow's theory contradicted the dominant paradigm, and dominant paradigms do not yield gracefully. When the Broad Street outbreak erupted in 1854, Snow saw his opportunity to prove the waterborne theory. With characteristic methodical precision, he began interviewing residents, tabulating cases, and mapping deaths. He walked the streets of Soho with a notebook, knocking on doors, asking the same questions over and over. Where do you get your water? Which pump do you use? When did the symptoms begin? The pattern that emerged was damning. Case after case clustered around a single water source, the public pump at Broad Street. Residents who used that pump fell ill. Residents who used other pumps, even those living just a few streets away, did not. A brewery on Broad Street, whose workers drank beer rather than water, reported 0 cholera cases. The evidence pointed with quiet but overwhelming force to the water. Snow's map, now one of the most famous data visualizations in the history of science, plotted each cholera death as a small black bar stacked against the nearest address. The cluster around the Broad Street pump was unmistakable, a dense, dark mass of mortality radiating outward from a single point. It was, in effect, a death map, and the pump was its epicenter. On September 7, 1854, Snow presented his findings to the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish, the local governing body responsible for the Broad Street area. He argued, with the calm intensity of a man who knew he was right, that the pump handle should be removed to prevent further contamination. The board, skeptical but frightened, agreed. The next day, the handle was removed. The outbreak subsided. The story of the pump handle removal has become one of the founding myths of public health, told and retold in epidemiology textbooks worldwide. And like most myths, it is slightly misleading. The outbreak was already declining when the handle was removed, likely because so many residents had fled or died. Snow himself acknowledged this, but the symbolic power of the act endured. Remove the source of contamination, and the killing stops. Snow later traced the contamination source to a cesspool located just 3 feet from the Broad Street pump well. The cesspool served a house at 40 Broad Street, where a baby had recently fallen ill with cholera. The baby's soiled diapers had been washed in water that was then emptied into the cesspool. The contaminated waste seeped through the soil into the well. 1 sick infant, 500 deaths. Despite the Broad Street evidence, Snow's waterborne theory remained controversial during his lifetime. The medical establishment clung to miasma theory with the tenacity of professionals who had built their careers on it. William Farr, the eminent statistician and registrar general, initially dismissed Snow's findings. Florence Nightingale, despite her revolutionary work in sanitation, was a committed miasmatist until late in her career. Snow died in 1858 at the age of 45 from a stroke. He did not live to see his theory vindicated. That vindication came in 1883, when Robert Koch, the German microbiologist, isolated Vibrio cholerae during an outbreak in Egypt, definitively proving that the disease was caused by a specific waterborne bacterium. Koch's discovery confirmed what Snow had argued 3 decades earlier. The water was the weapon. The tragedy embedded in this timeline is almost unbearable. Snow identified the mechanism of cholera transmission in 1854. Koch identified the organism in 1883. And yet, cholera continued to kill millions well into the 20th century because knowledge and implementation are separated by a gulf as wide as the Ganges Delta. Knowing that dirty water kills is not the same as having clean water. It has never been the same. And here is the fact that should keep you awake at night. The solution to cholera, to typhoid, to dysentery, to the vast majority of waterborne diseases that have killed hundreds of millions of human beings throughout history is staggeringly, almost insultingly simple. Boil the water. Heat it to 100 degrees Celsius and hold it there for 1 minute. The pathogens die. The water becomes safe. That is it. That is the entire intervention. Vibrio cholerae is killed at 70 degrees Celsius. Salmonella typhi dies at 60 degrees. Hepatitis A virus is inactivated at 85 degrees. Giardia cysts are destroyed at 70 degrees. Cryptosporidium, one of the hardiest waterborne pathogens, succumbs at a sustained rolling boil. 100 degrees. 1 minute. Centuries of plague, defeated by a process that requires nothing more than a pot, a flame, and the knowledge that it matters. The Chinese knew to boil their water 4,000 years ago. The Indians codified it in Ayurvedic texts 3,000 years ago. And yet, in 1854 London, one of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced cities on Earth, people were dying because they drank unboiled water from a contaminated pump. The knowledge existed. The habit did not. And that gap between knowledge and habit is where the bodies accumulated. It would take the combined efforts of epidemiologists, sanitary engineers, political reformers, and public health campaigners another half-century to transform Snow's insight into infrastructure. Filtration plants, chlorination systems, sewer networks, and municipal water treatment facilities would eventually make boiling unnecessary for most people in developed nations. But those systems cost money, require maintenance, and presuppose a functioning government. Not everyone has those luxuries. Today, as we noted at the beginning of this documentary, over 500,000 people die annually from contaminated water. The vast majority are children under 5, living in regions without access to treated water. For them, the solution remains what it has always been. Boil it. A $2 pot, a handful of firewood, and the knowledge that Jon Snow died trying to share. The simplest medical intervention in human history, still not universally practiced. There is a pub in Soho today at the corner of Broadwick Street, the modern name for Broad Street, called the Jon Snow. A replica of the original pump stands outside, its handle still attached. Tourists photograph it. Locals drink nearby. The ground beneath their feet still holds the residue of that terrible September, absorbed into the soil and the city's memory. London remembers, even if the rest of the world has chosen to forget. Jon Snow's legacy is not a cure. He did not discover an antibiotic or a vaccine. His legacy is a question, asked with enough persistence to change the world. Where does the water come from? Who touched it last? What is in it that you cannot see? These questions, so basic they seem almost childish, are the foundation of modern public health. And they all lead back to the same answer. When in doubt, boil it. The invisible killer was never truly invisible. It was hiding in plain sight in the water we carried, the wells we shared, the rivers we polluted and then drank from downstream. We simply refused to see it because seeing it meant accepting that something as innocent as a glass of water could be a death sentence. Denial is a powerful narcotic. It took a physician with a map and a removed pump handle to begin the long, slow process of sobering up. Let's talk about kettles. Specifically, let us talk about how a hollow metal container with a handle and a spout became one of the most culturally divisive objects in the modern world. That sounds like an exaggeration. It is not. The kettle, in its various forms and iterations, has started arguments between nations, exposed class anxieties, and very nearly brought the British electrical grid to its knees. Repeatedly. The earliest dedicated water boiling vessels were simple affairs. Bronze Age cauldrons, medieval iron pots, Renaissance copper kettles hung over open hearths on adjustable hooks called trammels. For centuries, boiling water required a fire, a vessel, and time. The process was essentially unchanged from the Neolithic era. You put water in a container. You put the container near heat. You waited. Humanity excels at waiting. The word kettle itself derives from the Old Norse kettle, which in turn came from the Latin catalyst, a diminutive of cadinus, meaning a deep vessel for cooking or serving. The linguistic journey from Roman cooking pot to Scandinavian cauldron to English kettle mirrors the object's own evolution, functional, unromantic, and deeply embedded in the vocabulary of daily survival. In Britain, the kettle's cultural ascent began in earnest in the 17th century, when tea arrived from China and rapidly transformed from an exotic curiosity into a national obsession. By 1700, tea consumption in Britain had grown from virtually nothing to a significant import commodity. By 1800, it was the national drink, and every cup of tea required one thing before all others: a kettle of boiling water. The early tea kettles of the Georgian era were works of art. Crafted from copper, brass, or silver, they featured ornate handles, engraved surfaces, and elaborate spouts. A fine kettle was a status symbol, displayed prominently in the parlor alongside the tea caddy and the sugar bowl. The quality of your kettle announced your social standing as clearly as your accent or your address. But for the working class, the kettle was no ornament. It was a survival tool. In the cramped, soot-darkened homes of industrial Britain, the kettle sat permanently on the hob, a shelf beside the coal fire, always warm, always ready. It provided hot water for tea, for washing, for cleaning wounds, for mixing with oatmeal. The working-class kettle was not silver. It was cast iron, blackened with use, and it never fully cooled. The class dynamics of the kettle are worth pausing on. In upper-class homes, a servant boiled the water. The lady of the house never touched the kettle. She touched the teapot. In middle-class homes, the kettle was managed by the wife or the domestic help. In working-class homes, the kettle belonged to everyone and no one. It was communal infrastructure, like a well or a shared outhouse, except it lived inside your house and you argued about who last filled it. The first electric kettle was patented in 1891 by the Carpenter Electric Company of Chicago. It was, by all accounts, terrible. The heating element was housed in a separate compartment beneath the water chamber, meaning the heat had to transfer through the metal wall before reaching the water. It was slow, inefficient, and had a habit of overheating its base. Still, it was the future. The future just needed some work. The breakthrough came in 1922, when Arthur Leslie Large, an engineer working for the British firm Bulpitt & Sons, developed a method for sealing an electric heating element directly inside the water chamber. For the first time, the element was immersed in the water itself, heating it directly rather than through a metal intermediary. Boiling time plummeted. Efficiency soared. The modern electric kettle was born. But the true revolution came in 1955 when Russell Hobbs, a small British appliance company, introduced the K1, the first fully automatic electric kettle that switched itself off when the water reached boiling point. The mechanism was beautifully simple. Steam from the boiling water was channeled through a tube to a bimetallic strip, which bent when heated and tripped a switch. The kettle boiled, clicked, and stopped. No supervision required. The Russell Hobbs K1 was not just an appliance. It was a liberation. Before automatic shut-off, an unattended kettle would boil dry, potentially starting a fire or, at minimum, ruining the kettle. This meant someone had to stand in the kitchen, listening for the whistle or watching for steam, unable to do anything else. The automatic kettle returned those minutes to their owner. In a nation that boiled water dozens of times per day, the cumulative time savings were staggering. By the 1970s, the electric kettle had achieved near total market penetration in British households. Today, an estimated 97% of British homes contain an electric kettle. It is the single most common kitchen appliance in the United Kingdom, more prevalent than toasters, microwaves, or dishwashers. The British relationship with the kettle is not preference. It is compulsion. This compulsion has measurable consequences for the national infrastructure. During commercial breaks in popular television programs, millions of British viewers simultaneously switch on their kettles, creating sudden surges in electricity demand known as TV pickups. The National Grid, Britain's electrical transmission system, employs dedicated staff to predict these surges by monitoring television schedules and adjusting power supply accordingly. The most famous TV pickup in history occurred on July 4th, 1990, during the penalty shootout of the FIFA World Cup semifinal between England and West Germany. When England was eliminated, an estimated 1.12 million kettles were switched on simultaneously, creating a demand surge of approximately 2,800 megawatts. That is roughly the output of 2 large nuclear power plants, activated in the time it takes to walk from a sofa to a kitchen counter. Grief, apparently, is thirsty work. Now, let us cross the Atlantic and confront one of the great cultural mysteries of the modern world. Why does the United States not use electric kettles? It is a question that baffles the British, amuses Europeans, and reveals a surprisingly deep fissure in the Anglo-American relationship. The answer involves voltage, coffee, cultural identity, and a stubbornness that borders on the geological. The technical explanation is straightforward. The United States operates on a 120-volt electrical system, compared to the 230-volt system used in Britain and most of Europe. Since power equals voltage times current, and American wall outlets are limited to 15 amperes, The maximum power available to an American kettle is roughly 1,800 watts. A British kettle, drawing from a 230-volt supply, can reach 3,000 watts. The British kettle boils water in about 2.5 minutes. The American kettle takes 4 to 5. That difference matters more than you might think. But the technical explanation is only half the story. The deeper reason is cultural. Americans drink coffee. Coffee, in the American tradition, is brewed in a dedicated machine, a drip coffee maker, a percolator, or an espresso device that heats its own water internally. The kettle is redundant. It solves a problem that the American kitchen has already solved by other means. Asking an American to buy an electric kettle is like asking someone who owns a car to also buy a bicycle. They can see the logic. They just do not feel the need. The cultural attachment to specific boiling technologies is not limited to the Anglo-American divide. In Russia, the samovar, a large metal urn that heats water using an internal charcoal or electric element, has been the centerpiece of domestic life since the 18th century. The word samovar translates literally to self-boiler, which is pleasingly direct. In Turkey, the çaydanlık, a double-stacked teapot arrangement, reflects a brewing philosophy entirely different from the British model. In Japan, the electric water boiler, or denki poto, is a fixture in nearly every home and office. Unlike a kettle, which boils water and then stops, the denki poto maintains water at a precise, selectable temperature continuously. It is a kettle that never turns off, always ready, always patient. In a culture that drinks green tea at specific temperatures ranging from 60 to 80 degrees Celsius, this precision is not luxury. It is necessity. The design evolution of the kettle in the late 20th and early 21st centuries tells its own story. From the utilitarian stainless steel cylinders of the 1970s to the translucent plastic jugs of the 1990s, with their illuminated water-level windows and concealed heating elements, the kettle has been relentlessly redesigned, reimagined, and restyled. It is one of the most frequently redesigned objects in industrial design, second only to the chair. Philippe Starck designed a kettle for Alessi in 1990 that looked like a small alien spacecraft and cost more than most people's monthly electricity bill. Michael Graves designed one with a tiny bird-shaped whistle on the spout that became an icon of postmodern design. The kettle, that most humble of devices, has been the canvas for some of the most celebrated industrial designers of the past century. Apparently, making water hot is worth making beautiful. Today, the global kettle market is valued at approximately $4.5 billion annually. Smart kettles connect to Wi-Fi and can be activated by voice command. Variable temperature kettles allow users to select precise temperatures for different types of tea. Gooseneck kettles, beloved by pour-over-coffee enthusiasts, offer controlled flow rates for optimal extraction. We have, in the space of a century, taken the simple act of heating water and turned it into a consumer electronics category. And yet, for all the innovation, for all the voltage wars and design competitions and smart home integration, the kettle does exactly what that first clay pot did 20,000 years ago. It holds water. It heats it. It gives it back to you, transformed. The technology has changed beyond recognition. The fundamental act has not changed at all. There is something comforting in that, or perhaps something slightly unsettling, depending on your disposition. Here is a fact that will ruin your next hiking trip. The higher you climb, the less useful boiling water becomes. At sea level, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, a temperature sufficient to kill pathogens, cook food, and brew a proper cup of tea. At 3,000 meters, roughly the altitude of many popular trekking destinations, it boils at about 90 degrees. The water bubbles, the food stays raw, and the tea tastes like a rumor of tea. The reason is atmospheric pressure. At sea level, the atmosphere exerts a pressure of approximately 101.325 kilopascals, or 1 atmosphere, on every surface, including the surface of your pot of water. This pressure acts as a kind of lid, holding the water molecules in their liquid state and requiring significant energy to push them into the gas phase. At higher altitudes, there is less atmosphere above you, so less pressure, so less resistance to boiling. The relationship between pressure and boiling point is described by the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, a piece of thermodynamic mathematics that relates the slope of a phase boundary on a pressure-temperature diagram to the latent heat of the transition and the volume change between phases. It sounds intimidating. It is. But the practical consequence is simple. Less pressure equals lower boiling point. Every 300 meters of altitude drops the boiling point by roughly 1 degree Celsius. At the summit of Mount Everest, 8,849 meters above sea level, atmospheric pressure drops to approximately 1/3 of its sea level value. Water boils at roughly 70 degrees Celsius. This is warm enough for a comfortable bath, but entirely inadequate for cooking rice, boiling eggs, or sterilizing surgical instruments. Climbers at extreme altitude must use specialized pressure cookers or resign themselves to meals with the texture and flavor of lukewarm disappointment. The inability to cook properly at extreme altitude is not a minor inconvenience. It is a survival problem. Climbers above 7,000 meters require between 6,000 and 10,000 calories per day to sustain the extraordinary metabolic demands of high-altitude exertion. But their food cannot be cooked thoroughly because the water will not get hot enough. They eat partially rehydrated meals, tepid soups, and energy bars with the consistency of frozen clay. Nutrition at altitude is a war of attrition, and the boiling point is a traitor. The people who have dealt with this problem longest are not mountaineers. They are the residents of the world's high plateaus. The Tibetan Plateau at an average elevation of 4,500 meters, the Altiplano of Bolivia and Peru at 3,750 meters, and the Ethiopian highlands at roughly 2,500 meters. These communities have spent centuries developing cooking techniques adapted to the stubborn refusal of water to behave itself at altitude. In Tibet, where the average elevation makes water boil at approximately 85 degrees Celsius, traditional cooking has evolved around this limitation. Tsampa, the Tibetan staple food, is made from roasted barley flour that requires no boiling at all. It is mixed with butter tea and shaped by hand into small balls. It is dense, caloric, portable, and entirely independent of the boiling point. It is in effect engineering around a thermodynamic constraint. Butter tea itself, known as pacha, is a remarkable adaptation. Rather than boiling tea leaves in the conventional sense, Tibetans simmer compressed tea bricks in water for hours at the lower local boiling point, then churn the resulting strong brew with yak butter and salt. The extended simmering time compensates for the lower temperature. What the water lacks in heat, the cook compensates with patience. It is a relationship built on compromise. In the Andes, the situation is similar. The city of La Paz, Bolivia, sits at approximately 3,640 meters above sea level, making it the highest administrative capital in the world. Water in La Paz boils at about 87 degrees Celsius. Cooking beans, a dietary staple across Latin America, takes significantly longer at this temperature, sometimes 2 to 3 times as long as at sea level. Gas bills in La Paz reflect this physical reality in ways that residents find neither amusing nor negotiable. The solution that transformed high-altitude cooking arrived not from the mountains but from the laboratory. In 1679, the French physicist Denis Papin invented a device he called the steam digester, a sealed cooking vessel that trapped steam to increase internal pressure and thereby raise the boiling point of the water inside. It was the first pressure cooker, and it was born from a very specific frustration. Papin wanted to extract gelatin from bones more efficiently. Papin's device worked on a principle that was, in retrospect, obvious. If lower pressure reduces the boiling point, then higher pressure must increase it. By sealing a vessel and allowing steam pressure to build inside, the boiling point of the trapped water could be pushed well above 100 degrees to 120, 130, even 140 degrees Celsius, depending on the pressure. Food cooked faster. flavors intensified, and the occasional explosion added an element of excitement. The explosions were not metaphorical. Early pressure cookers had a distressing tendency to blow their lids under excessive pressure, launching scalding contents across the kitchen with the enthusiasm of a small volcano. Papin himself addressed this problem by inventing the safety valve, a weighted release mechanism that vented excess steam before pressure reached dangerous levels. It was simultaneously the first pressure cooker accessory and the first admission that the device could kill you. Modern pressure cookers operate at approximately 15 pounds per square inch above atmospheric pressure, which raises the boiling point of water to about 121 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, cooking times are reduced by roughly 2/3. Dried beans that take 2 hours at sea level cook in 40 minutes. A tough beef stew that requires 3 hours of simmering is done in 1. The pressure cooker does not merely cook faster. It bends the physics of boiling to its will. In India, the pressure cooker is not just a convenience. It is a cultural institution. The distinctive success of the pressure cooker's weight valve, followed by its rhythmic whistling, is one of the most recognizable domestic sounds in the subcontinent. Indian recipes routinely specify cooking times in whistles rather than minutes. Cook for 3 whistles is a perfectly clear instruction to approximately 1.4 billion people and a complete mystery to everyone else. Hawkins, an Indian pressure cooker manufacturer founded in 1959, sells millions of units annually and is one of the most recognized brand names in Indian households. The company's products are so ubiquitous that Hawkins has become, in many regions, a generic term for any pressure cooker, the way Xerox once meant any photocopy. In India, the pressure cooker is not an appliance. It is vocabulary. Now, let us go in the opposite direction. Below sea level, atmospheric pressure increases, and with it, the boiling point of water rises. At the shore of the Dead Sea, approximately 430 meters below sea level, the lowest land elevation on Earth, atmospheric pressure is roughly 1,065 hectopascals, about 5% higher than its sea level. Water there boils at approximately 101.4 degrees Celsius. It is a small difference, but it is measurable. It means your eggs cook slightly faster at the Dead Sea than they do in Jerusalem. The most extreme demonstration of pressure's effect on boiling occurs not on any mountain or in any valley, but in the vacuum of space. In the near total vacuum outside the International Space Station, where pressure approaches zero, water boils at essentially any temperature above freezing. Expose liquid water to the vacuum of space, and it does not simply evaporate. It boils explosively, flash vaporizing in a violent eruption of gas and ice crystals. The vacuum does not ask water to boil. It insists. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station face the inverse problem of high-altitude climbers. Their water is contained in pressurized modules at roughly 1 atmosphere, so it boils normally. But heating it in microgravity is a challenge because convection, the natural circulation of hot water rising and cool water sinking that drives efficient heating on Earth, does not work without gravity. Hot water just sits there, smugly, next to its cooler neighbors. NASA has spent considerable research effort on boiling water in microgravity, not out of culinary interest, but because boiling heat transfer is critical to the cooling systems of spacecraft and space habitats. In the absence of buoyancy-driven convection, vapor bubbles in microgravity grow much larger than their earthly counterparts, forming enormous, wobbling spheres that cling to the heating surface rather than detaching and rising. It is eerie, beautiful, and deeply impractical. The boiling behavior of water, then, is not a fixed property of the substance. It is a conversation between the water and its environment. The weight of the atmosphere, the pull of gravity, the shape of the container, the roughness of the surface, even the presence of dissolved impurities, all participate in determining when and how water transitions from liquid to gas. Boiling is not a fact. It is a negotiation, and the terms are different everywhere you go. The next time you struggle to brew tea at a mountain cabin, or watch your pressure cooker whistle its impatient song, remember this: you are not merely cooking. You are navigating a thermodynamic landscape shaped by the mass of the entire atmosphere above your head. The pot is simple. The physics governing it spans the distance from the Mariana Trench to the edge of space. Boiling water, as always, is anything but simple. Everything you see around you, every building, every road, every screen, every vehicle, every wire carrying electricity to every lamp in every city on Earth, exists because someone figured out how to boil water on an industrial scale. That is not rhetoric. That is engineering history. The Industrial Revolution, the single most transformative event in human civilization since the invention of agriculture, was powered by steam. And steam is just boiling water wearing a work uniform. The story begins appropriately underground. In the coal mines of late 17th century England, flooding was a constant and devastating problem. As mines were dug deeper to meet the growing demand for coal, they penetrated the water table, and groundwater filled the shafts faster than human or animal labor could pump it out. Mines were abandoned. Fortunes were lost. The industry needed a machine that could pump water tirelessly and did not require feeding or rest. In 1698, Thomas Savery, a military engineer from Devon, patented a device he called the miner's friend, or an engine to raise water by fire. The name was both descriptive and aspirational. Savery's engine used steam pressure to push water out of a sealed chamber and a vacuum created by condensing steam to pull water up from below. It had no moving parts, which was elegant, and a tendency to explode under pressure, which was less so. Savery's engine could lift water from a depth of only about 25 feet before the limitations of atmospheric pressure made further suction impossible. For deeper mines, multiple engines would need to be stacked, each one pumping to a reservoir from which the next one drew. It was clumsy, expensive, and marginally better than the horse-powered pumps it was meant to replace. But it proved a principle: boiling water could do mechanical work. The next leap came from Thomas Newcomen, a Dartmouth ironmonger who, in 1712, built the first practical atmospheric steam engine. Newcomen's design was radically different from Savery's. It used a piston inside a cylinder, driven downward by atmospheric pressure after steam beneath the piston was condensed by a jet of cold water. The piston's downward stroke pulled a beam, which pulled a pump rod, which lifted water from the mine. It was slow, rhythmic, and hypnotically powerful. The Newcomen engine was an immediate success, despite being spectacularly inefficient. It consumed enormous quantities of coal because the cylinder had to be alternately heated with steam and cooled with water for every single stroke. Roughly 99% of the thermal energy from the burning coal was wasted. But coal was cheap and plentiful in mining regions, and the engine could pump water 24 hours a day without complaint, fatigue, or wages. By 1733, over 100 Newcomen engines were operating across Britain. For over 50 years, the Newcomen engine dominated. Then, in 1763, a young Scottish instrument maker at the University of Glasgow named James Watt was asked to repair a model Newcomen engine used for teaching demonstrations. Watt fixed the model, but he could not stop thinking about its inefficiency. The constant heating and cooling of the same cylinder offended his engineering sensibility. There had to be a better way. There was, and Watt found it. Watt's insight, which came to him, according to legend, during a Sunday walk on Glasgow Green in 1765, was the separate condenser. Instead of cooling the main cylinder to condense the steam, why not divert the spent steam into a separate, permanently cold vessel? The main cylinder could stay hot. The condenser could stay cold. No more wasteful thermal cycling. The efficiency gains were immediate and enormous, reducing coal consumption by roughly 75%. But Watt was an inventor, not a businessman. Turning his insight into a commercial product required capital, manufacturing capability, and relentless promotion. Enter Matthew Boulton, a Birmingham industrialist whose Soho manufactory was one of the largest and most advanced factories in England. Bolton saw the potential immediately. "I sell here, sir, what all the world desires to have," he reportedly told James Boswell. Power. The partnership of Bolton and Watt, formalized in 1775, became one of the most consequential business relationships in history. Bolton provided the capital and the manufacturing. Watt provided the engineering genius and a stream of continuous improvements: the double-acting engine, the rotary motion converter, the centrifugal governor, the pressure gauge. Together, they did not just build steam engines. They built the infrastructure of an entirely new world. By the 1780s, Watt engines were no longer confined to mines. They were powering cotton mills in Manchester, iron forges in Coalbrookdale, flour mills in London, and breweries across the Midlands. The engine had crossed a threshold, from a specialized pumping device to a general-purpose power source. Anywhere you needed rotary motion, a Watt engine could provide it. The factory system, and with it the entire structure of industrial capitalism, was boiling water's gift to the world. The human cost of this transformation was appalling. The factories powered by steam engines were brutally dangerous environments. Workers, including children as young as 5, labored 12 to 16 hours per day in deafening, sweltering rooms. Unguarded machinery maimed and killed with routine indifference. The steam that powered the machines also filled the air with scalding vapor when pipes leaked or boilers vented. The power that boiling water provided came at a price measured in fingers, limbs, and lives. Boiler explosions were a particular horror of the steam age. Early boilers were constructed from riveted iron plates of inconsistent quality, and the science of pressure containment was poorly understood. When a boiler failed, it failed catastrophically, releasing superheated steam and shrapnel with the force of a bomb. Between 1880 and 1910, boiler explosions killed an estimated 50,000 people in the United States alone. The Hartford Steam Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company, founded in 1866, exists because boiling water kept killing people. The next revolution in steam power came from Richard Trevithick, a Cornish engineer who had the audacity to do what James would explicitly warned against: build high-pressure engines. Watt's engines operated at pressures barely above atmospheric, relying on the vacuum created by condensation to do most of the work. Trevithick's engines used pressures of 40, 50, even 145 pounds per square inch, generating far more power from smaller, lighter machines. Watt thought Trevithick was reckless. Trevithick thought Watt was timid. Both were correct. In 1804, Trevithick mounted one of his high-pressure engines on a wheeled chassis and ran it along the tramway of the Penydarren Ironworks in South Wales. It hauled 10 tons of iron and 70 men along 9 miles of track. It was the first successful steam locomotive journey in history. The railway age, the age that would shrink continents and redraw the maps of commerce and empire, began with boiling water pushing iron wheels along iron rails. George Stephenson refined Trevithick's concept into a commercially viable system. His rocket, built for the 1829 Rainhill trials, achieved speeds of 29 miles per hour and convinced skeptics that steam locomotives were not merely curiosities but the future of transportation. Within 2 decades, Britain was crisscrossed with over 6,000 miles of railway track. Within 4 decades, the number had tripled. The landscape itself was being reshaped by boiling water. Meanwhile, on the water, steam was performing an equally radical transformation. The first commercially successful steamship, Robert Fulton's North River Steamboat, made its maiden voyage up the Hudson River in 1807, covering 150 miles in 32 hours. Sailing vessels, which had dominated oceanic trade and warfare for millennia, suddenly faced obsolescence. A steamship did not care about the direction of the wind. It carried its own wind, generated by boiling water, in its belly. By the 1840s, the great ocean steamship lines were connecting continents with a regularity that would have seemed miraculous a generation earlier. The Cunard Line, founded in 1839, offered scheduled transatlantic service between Liverpool and Boston. The journey took roughly 14 days, a fraction of the 6 to 8 weeks required by sailing ships. The Atlantic Ocean, for centuries a formidable barrier between the Old World and the New, had been reduced by steam to a minor inconvenience. The steam engine's appetite for water was prodigious. A large locomotive consumed roughly 10,000 gallons of water per 100 miles of travel. The massive triple expansion engines of late 19th century steamships required even more. Entire infrastructures of water towers, pumping stations, and tender cars were built solely to keep the engines fed. The industrial age did not just use boiling water. It was addicted to it. And here is the twist that brings this chapter full circle. The steam engine's greatest legacy is not the railway or the steamship or the factory. It is the power plant. In the 1880s, Thomas Edison and his rivals began building electrical generating stations, and the vast majority of them used steam turbines to spin their generators. Coal heated water. Water became steam. Stam spun a turbine. The turbine generated electricity. It was boiling water, one step removed. Today, in the year you are watching this documentary, approximately 63% of the world's electricity is generated by steam turbines. Coal plants, natural gas plants, nuclear plants, concentrated solar thermal plants, and geothermal plants all share the same fundamental mechanism. They boil water, use the resulting steam to spin a turbine, and convert the turbine's rotational energy into electrical current. The fuel changes. The principle does not. We are still, in 2026, a civilization powered by boiling water. Nuclear power, often presented as the pinnacle of modern energy technology, is at its heart a spectacularly sophisticated method of boiling water. A pressurized water reactor splits uranium atoms, releasing energy that heats pressurized water to over 300 degrees Celsius. This hot water transfers its heat to a secondary loop, where a different batch of water boils into steam, which drives a turbine. Billions of dollars of engineering, decades of research, and the fundamental energy source of the stars, all in service of making water bubble. There's a joke among nuclear engineers that a nuclear reactor is just a very expensive, very complicated, and very dangerous way to boil water. They laugh when they say it, but the laughter has a nervous edge because the joke is also completely accurate. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, 3 of the worst industrial disasters in human history, and all 3 were, at their core, failures to properly manage the boiling of water. From Savory's hand pump to the nuclear reactor core, from the coal mine to the electrical grid, the story of industrial power is the story of boiling water at increasing temperatures, pressures, and scales. We took a Neolithic technique and amplified it until it could light cities, propel ships across oceans, and split atoms. The pot got bigger. The fire got hotter. The ambition got terrifying. But the water still boils at the same molecular threshold. Some things even industry cannot change. We live in a world where a person in London can say, "Alexa, boil the kettle," from their bed, and by the time they reach the kitchen, 1.7 liters of water will be a rolling boil. That same morning, a woman in rural South Sudan will walk 4 miles to a borehole, fill a 20-liter jerry can, carry it back on her head, and give the water to her children without boiling it, because she has no fuel. Both events are real. Both happen daily. Both involve the same substance. According to the WHO and UNICEF Joint Monitoring Program, 2.2 billion people worldwide lack access to safely managed drinking water services. That is nearly 1 in 3 human beings. Of those, 785 million lack even a basic water service, defined as an improved source within a 30-minute round trip. For 144 million people, the primary water source is untreated surface water, rivers, lakes, and ponds. They are, in terms of water safety, living in the same conditions as a Victorian Londoner. The arithmetic of this crisis is simple and damning. Diarrheal diseases, the vast majority of which are caused by contaminated water, kill approximately 1,200 children under 5 every single day. That is one child every 72 seconds. By the time you finish watching this chapter, roughly 200 children will have died from diseases that boiling water prevents. The solution is 20,000 years old. The implementation lags behind by millennia. The barriers to universal water boiling are not technological. They are economic, logistical, and cultural. Fuel costs money. In sub-Saharan Africa, where firewood is the primary cooking fuel, the time and labor required to gather enough wood to boil water competes directly with the time needed for farming, childcare, and income generation. A mother who spends 3 hours collecting firewood is a mother who is not working, not tending her crops, not watching her other children. The cost of boiling is measured in more than currency. Indoor air pollution from burning biomass fuels for cooking and water boiling kills an estimated 3.8 million people annually, according to the WHO. The smoke from wood, charcoal, and dung fires causes respiratory infections, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung cancer, and stroke. In many cases, the act of boiling water to prevent waterborne disease creates airborne disease instead. It is a cruel exchange, and it falls disproportionately on women and children who spend the most time near the cooking fire. Technology offers alternatives. Ceramic water filters, developed from traditional pottery techniques, can remove over 99% of bacteria from water without any fuel input. LifeStraw, a portable filtration device invented by Vestergaard Fransen, allows users to drink directly from contaminated sources through a filter that removes bacteria, parasites, and microplastics. Solar water disinfection, known as SODIS, uses UV radiation from sunlight to kill pathogens in clear plastic bottles exposed to direct sun for 6 hours. These technologies are elegant, affordable, and effective. They are also woefully underdistributed. The global clean water nonprofit sector has made significant progress, with organizations like Water.org, Charity, Water, and WaterAid reaching millions. But the scale of the problem dwarfs the scale of the response. The gap between what we could do and what we are doing is not a crack. It is a chasm. And at the bottom of that chasm, people are dying of thirst for the want of a boiled pot of water. Meanwhile, in the developed world, a different paradox unfolds. People who have access to some of the cleanest, most rigorously tested tap water in human history have decided they do not trust it. The global bottled water industry generates approximately $350 billion in annual revenue. Consumers pay, on average, 2,000 times more per gallon for bottled water than for tap water. Much of that bottled water is, in fact, filtered tap water in a plastic container with a mountain on the label. Nestle, Danone, PepsiCo, and Coca-Cola dominate the bottled water market, collectively controlling a significant share of global sales. Their marketing suggests purity, nature, glacial origins, mountain springs. The reality is frequently more prosaic. Aquafina, PepsiCo's flagship water brand, sources its water from municipal tap water supplies and processes it through reverse osmosis filtration. Dasani, Coca-Cola's equivalent, does the same. You are paying for the bottle, the brand, and the peace of mind. The water was already safe. The environmental consequences of bottled water are staggering. Approximately 481 billion plastic water bottles are sold worldwide each year. Fewer than 10% are recycled. The remainder end up in landfills, rivers, oceans, and the digestive systems of marine animals. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a floating island of plastic debris roughly twice the size of Texas, contains a significant proportion of water bottles. We pollute the very water we're trying to avoid drinking. The irony is so thick you could bottle it. And then there is the genuinely baffling phenomenon of raw water. Beginning around 2017, a movement emerged primarily in Silicon Valley and health-conscious communities in the western United States advocating for the consumption of untreated, unfiltered, unboiled spring water. Proponents argued that municipal water treatment removes beneficial minerals and that chlorine and fluoride additives are harmful. The company Live Water sold untreated spring water at $37 per 2.5-gallon jug. It occasionally turned green. Epidemiologists responded to the raw water movement with a mixture of horror and exhausted disbelief. Dr. Donald Hensrud of the Mayo Clinic noted that untreated water can contain bacteria, viruses, parasites, and animal waste, precisely the contaminants that have killed hundreds of millions of people throughout human history. The raw water movement is, in effect, a voluntary return to pre-Jon Snow conditions by people with sufficient privilege to choose their own risk level. History, it appears, is not immune to relapse. But before we dismiss the distrust of tap water as mere affluent paranoia, it is worth remembering Flint, Michigan. In April 2014, the city of Flint switched its water supply from the Detroit system to the Flint River as a cost-saving measure. The river water was highly corrosive, and the city failed to apply corrosion inhibitors. Within months, the corrosive water had leached lead from the aging pipes into the drinking supply. Over 100,000 residents, many of them low-income and predominantly African American, were exposed to dangerous levels of lead. The Flint water crisis was not a developing world catastrophe. It happened in the United States of America, in the state of Michigan, in the 21st century. It was caused not by a lack of technology, but by a failure of governance, a prioritization of cost savings over public health, and a systemic indifference to the welfare of a majority black, majority poor community. 12 people died from Legionnaire's disease linked to the contaminated water. The full health consequences, particularly the neurological effects of lead exposure on children, may take generations to measure. In Flint, during the worst of the crisis, authorities issued boil water advisories, instructing residents to boil their tap water before consumption. But boiling does not remove lead. Lead is a dissolved metal, not a pathogen. Boiling water contaminated with lead actually concentrates the lead by reducing the water volume. The advisory was well-intentioned and scientifically wrong. Even the most ancient and reliable water purification method has its limits. The Flint crisis exposed a deeper truth about water safety in the modern world. The infrastructure that delivers clean water to hundreds of millions of people in developed nations is aging, underfunded, and vulnerable. The American Society of Civil Engineers gives United States drinking water infrastructure a grade of C-. An estimated 6 billion gallons of treated water are lost daily to leaking pipes. The system works, but it works the way a car with 200,000 miles on the odometer works, nervously. Climate change adds another layer of complexity. Rising temperatures increase the metabolic activity of waterborne pathogens, potentially accelerating their growth in warming water sources. Flooding events, which are increasing in frequency and severity, overwhelm sewage treatment systems and contaminate drinking water supplies. Drought reduces water availability and concentrates pollutants in shrinking reservoirs. The relationship between humanity and its water is being renegotiated by a changing climate, and the terms are not favorable. There is a growing movement in public health to reintroduce boiling as a household water treatment practice, even in countries with municipal treatment systems, particularly during emergencies, natural disasters, and infrastructure failures. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's official guidance for emergency water treatment is bracingly simple. Bring water to a rolling boil for 1 minute, or 3 minutes at altitudes above 6,500 feet. Let cool. Store in clean containers. That is it. 20,000 years of progress, and the CDC's best advice is still, boil it. The energy cost of boiling water at a global scale is not trivial. The United Kingdom alone boils an estimated 100 million cups of tea per day. If every kettle uses an average of 0.1 kilowatt hours per boil, that is 10 million kilowatt hours daily, or 3.65 billion kilowatt hours per year, just for British tea. Globally, the energy devoted to boiling water for beverages, cooking, and sterilization constitutes a measurable fraction of total energy consumption. Boiling water has a carbon footprint, and it is bigger than you might expect. And yet, for all its cost, for all its paradoxes, for all the inequities it exposes and the arguments it ignites, boiling remains. It remains because it works. It remains because it is accessible to anyone with a container and heat source. It remains because no technology, however sophisticated, has entirely replaced the simple, universal, 20,000-year-old act of heating water until it transforms. The paradox of the modern world is that we have not outgrown our oldest survival skill. We have merely added Wi-Fi to it. We are back where we started. A pot of water on a stove. The flame is lit. The surface is still. You have been here before 1,000 times, perhaps 10,000. But you have never been here knowing what you know now. You have never stood in a kitchen with the full weight of 20,000 years of history pressing against the back of your mind. The pot looks different now, doesn't it? It should. We have traveled a very long way together. From the African savanna, where Homo erectus first captured fire, to the Zionrinden cave where anonymous hands shaped the first clay pot. From Lu Yu's meditations on the stages of a boil to the cholera-soaked streets of Victorian Soho. From the thundering pistons of James Watt's engines to the silent hum of a nuclear reactor's cooling loop. All of it connected by water and heat. What does this story tell us about ourselves? It tells us that we are a species capable of extraordinary insight and extraordinary negligence, often simultaneously. We discovered that boiling water saves lives 4,000 years ago and have still not managed to deliver that knowledge to everyone who needs it. We built nuclear reactors to boil water and then failed to prevent 3 of them from catastrophically failing. We are brilliant and careless in equal measure. It tells us that the most important things in life are often the most invisible. No one gives a standing ovation to a kettle. No child grows up dreaming of being a water treatment engineer. The infrastructure that delivers clean water to your tap operates in the same cognitive blind spot as gravity or oxygen, essential, omnipresent, and utterly ignored until it fails. We notice water only when it hurts us. The rest of the time, it pours unacknowledged from the faucet, and we turn away. The future of water purification is being written in laboratories and field stations around the world. Forward osmosis membranes that can desalinate seawater at a fraction of the energy cost of current systems. Graphene oxide filters that can sieve individual ions from water. Solar-powered UV LED systems that disinfect water without heat, without fuel, without electricity from a grid. The technologies exist. The funding is growing. The will, as always, is the variable. Desalination, the process of removing salt from seawater to produce fresh water, is often presented as the ultimate solution to global water scarcity. There is, after all, no shortage of seawater. The oceans contain approximately 1.335 billion cubic kilometers of water, roughly 97% of all water on Earth. If we could efficiently desalinate even a fraction of that, the water crisis would evaporate, if you will pardon the expression. But desalination is energy-intensive, expensive, and environmentally problematic. The most common method, reverse osmosis, forces seawater through semi-permeable membranes at high pressure, requiring approximately 3 to 4 kilowatt-hours per cubic meter of freshwater produced. The concentrated brine waste, a hypersaline liquid that is toxic to most marine life, must be disposed of carefully. Desalination works. It just works the way cardiac surgery works, effectively, expensively, and ideally as a last resort. Perhaps the most promising development is the simplest, the recognition that boiling water, far from being an outdated relic of pre-industrial life, remains the most universally accessible water purification method on Earth. Organizations like the WHO now actively promote household water treatment and safe storage, known as HWTS, as a complement to, not a replacement for, municipal water systems. Boiling is the first line of defense. It always has been. There is a philosophical dimension to boiling that we have circled around for 5 hours without directly addressing. Boiling is transformation. It is the application of energy to matter for the purpose of changing its state. It is, in the most literal sense, alchemy. the conversion of one thing into another through the application of fire. The alchemists sought to turn lead into gold. Every morning, you turn water into steam. Congratulations, you are a minor alchemist. Your laboratory is the kitchen. Every phase transition is, at the molecular level, an act of liberation. The molecules in liquid water are bound to their neighbors, constrained by hydrogen bonds, locked in a restless but finite dance. When they boil, they break free. They become gas. They disperse into the atmosphere, carried by wind to destinations unknown. It is tempting to read metaphor into this, and I will not resist the temptation. Boiling is what happens when enough energy accumulates to overcome the forces that hold things in place. Revolutions work the same way. Social change, political upheaval, scientific paradigm shifts. They simmer for years, decades, centuries, building energy, accumulating grievance or insight, until a critical threshold is reached and the system transforms irreversibly. The French Revolution was a political boiling point. The Civil Rights Movement was a social one. The moment Jon Snow removed the pump handle was an epidemiological one. The metaphor is not accidental. It is structural. But let us not disappear entirely into abstraction. Let us come back to the kitchen, to the pot, to the water, to the flame. Because for all the grand narratives of empire and industry and science, the most common experience of boiling water is domestic, personal, and quiet. It is a person in a kitchen at the end of a long day, heating water for tea or coffee or soup. It is a ritual performed in solitude, requiring no audience and no applause. There is something meditative about waiting for water to boil. The sound changes as the temperature rises. First silence, then a faint hiss as dissolved gases escape, then a low rumble as convection currents establish themselves, then the rising crescendo of nucleation, and finally the full, rolling, percussive roar of a vigorous boil. It is a 4-minute symphony performed by water and heat, and it sounds the same whether you are in Tokyo or Timbuktu. The proverb says a watched pot never boils. Like most proverbs, it is wrong. Watched pots boil exactly as quickly as unwatched ones. The proverb is not about physics. It is about perception, about the human tendency to experience time more slowly when we are focused on waiting for a specific event. It is about patience or the lack of it. And if this documentary has taught you anything, it should be that the history of boiling water is a history of patience. Patience to tend to fire for 1 million years before inventing the pot. Patience to develop the ceramic arts over millennia. Patience to sit with dying cholera patients and ask the right questions. Patience to refine an engine through decades of incremental improvement. Patience to fight for clean water infrastructure in communities that powerful people would rather ignore. The history of boiling water is the history of humans refusing to give up on a simple idea, that things can be made better by applying heat. I began this documentary by asking whether 5 hours about boiling water was excessive. I hope by now you have concluded that it was not, that the subject is, if anything, inexhaustible, that every bubble contains a story, every wisp of steam carries a ghost, and every pot on every stove in every kitchen in every country on this planet is connected by an unbroken chain of heat and necessity to the very first human who held fire beneath water and changed the world. If you remembered nothing else from these 5 hours, remember this. Water is not simple. It is the most deceptive substance on Earth. It looks clear. It looks clean. It looks innocent, but has killed more people than any war, any famine, any plague that did not travel through it first. And the difference between water that heals and water that kills is almost always 100 degrees Celsius. The next time you boil water, and there will be a next time, probably within the hour, I want you to watch it. Really watch it. See the first tiny bubbles forming on the bottom of the pot, the dissolved ghosts of atmosphere being driven out by heat. See the shimmer of convection, the warmer water rising, the cooler water sinking, an endless cycle of displacement and return. See, the first real bubbles form at the nucleation sites, those tiny imperfections that make transformation possible. Watch the bubbles grow, detach, rise. Watch them burst to the surface, releasing their cargo of steam into the air above your kitchen. Watch the surface break into a full, rolling boil, that beautiful, violent, ancient chaos that has been happening on this planet since the first volcano heated the first puddle billions of years before any eye existed to witness it. You are witnessing a phase transition. You are witnessing transformation. You are witnessing one of the oldest processes in the universe. And then pour it over your tea leaves, or your coffee grounds, or your instant noodles. Let it cool to a temperature your mouth can tolerate. Drink it, and as you drink, know that you are performing an act of continuity that stretches back 20,000 years to the first person who tasted boiled water and found it good. You are part of a chain, the longest, quietest, most important chain in human history. The pot is empty now. The flame is off. The steam has dissipated into the atmosphere, where it will rise, cool, condense, fall as rain, seep into the earth, emerge from spring, flow into a river, and eventually, inevitably, find its way into another pot, on another stove, in another kitchen, where another human being will apply heat and start the cycle again. Water remembers. It always comes back, and we will always be here, waiting for it to boil. This has been How to Boil Water. The instructions, in case you missed them, are as follows. Fill a pot with water. Place it over heat. Wait. That is all. That is everything.